This is a Best in Climate episode of Earth Feels, where each week your hosts Rose and Christine read to you from some of the best climate-related blogs and articles on the web.
This week's Best in Climate comes to us from The Nation. This column is a part of Covering Climate Now, a global journalism collaboration co-founded by the Columbia Journalism Review and The Nation to strengthen coverage of the climate story. The authors are Mary Annaïse Heglar and Amy Westervelt, who I have featured several times in Best in Climate. These two women really get to the heart of the matter pretty quickly with no BS. This article is entitled, "Nice Isn't Going to Save the Planet. In a rapidly heating world, we don't have time for etiquette." No matter what he says today, climate activist Lauren MacDonald said through tears in her opening lines at the TED Countdown panel in Edinburgh, remember, Shell has spent millions covering up the warnings from climate scientists, bribing politicians, and even paying soldiers to kill Nigerian activists fighting against them, all whilst rebranding to make it look as though they care and that they have the intention of changing. She said this even though the TED conference organizers had spent 4 hours pushing her to be more genteel, more neutral. She said it even though the man she was talking about, Shell CEO Ben van Beurden, was sitting on the stage with her when he faltered in his response. MacDonald would not share the stage with him any longer and walked out along with dozens of other activists. In the aftermath of the TED bust-up, Van Beurden went home, opting not to attend COP26 because he said he felt, quote, unwelcome, end quote. At the same time, activists occupied London's Science Museum to protest its many sponsorship deals with fossil fuel industries. And in the United States, youth climate activists began what would become a 2-week hunger strike to demand real climate action from the Biden administration. That strike ended when the group secured various promises from Democrats that a deal on climate policy would be reached, only to have Senator Joe Manchin once again argue that Biden's Build Back Better bill is just too expensive, demanding that it be run through a thorough analysis by the Congressional Budget Office before he votes on it. Last week, those same activists, still weak from their hunger strike, joined a crowd to swarm Manchin as he drove out of Washington, D.C. parking garage in his Maserati. Manchin calls activists like these entitled. Others call them uncivil. At COP this week, Barack Obama chided them for yelling. The executive secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN entity that oversees the COP gatherings and whatever treaties come out of them, and organizer of the TED event, Christiana Figueres, cried after MacDonald's confrontation with Van Beurden, not because she suddenly realized the folly of inviting an oil exec to a climate event, but because the conflict was all so ugly. These reactions are a profound, willful misinterpretation of what civil means when it comes to civil disobedience. The word speaks to the power of ordinary people, to the coming together of the public. It does not mean civilized or courteous. The reality is that climate activists spent decades politely asking for the world's leaders to please act on this thing that is going to kill millions. They held respectful dialogue in respectable forums. They produced charts and came up with a plethora of acceptable solutions that, had they been enacted on a reasonable timescale, would not have posed a dramatic threat to the status quo. Over and over again, they met bad faith actors in good faith. And in response, they were lied to and saw little meaningful action. Is political corruption civil? Is it polite for a senator to risk dooming the planet before sailing off on the yacht he bought with the $500,000 he earns every year from the fossil fuel industry? Since 2018, the youth climate movement has reminded the world what people fighting for their lives looks like. It's not well-mannered, nor should it be. Did gracious requests get rid of Jim Crow? Is there any justice movement in history that has succeeded on account of its proper etiquette? As Frederick Douglass said, quote, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will," end quote. If you still think oil companies should be part of the solution, or that they will voluntarily accomplish what needs to be done, let's take another look at Shell. Earlier this year, a Dutch court ordered the company to ratchet up its climate commitments and reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the board, not just their own emissions, but customers as well, by 45% by 2030. Shell is appealing that ruling, and in the meantime has announced its own commitment to reduce emissions 45% by 2030, but only its internal emissions, which account for only 10% of the company's emissions overall. What they are willing to do is 90% less than what we need them to do. This is about a year after a handful of Shell's renewable energy leaders quit because the company's timeline for getting off fossil fuels was just too slow. At the same time, some Shell execs said the company was actually doing plenty to transition away from fossil fuels. It just wasn't talking about it enough. Folks, that's code for more corporate greenwashing. And that was a month after Shell got humiliated on Twitter for just such an approach. They were never engaging in good faith. They don't know how. Some folks say that Manchin's obstinance is proof that the in-your-face approach of youth climate activists doesn't work. But it's not like asking him nicely worked either. Moreover, what we see in internal documents from oil companies is that the youth climate movement is the first thing that's ever really made them worry about losing their social license. In a leaked 2020 marketing strategy doc from BP, executives worried that, quote, "the new voices of global influence are changing from governments, NGOs, and corporates to the people," end quote. Uh-oh. Unlike a certain senator from West Virginia, it looks like the people might not be so easily influenced and paid off. According to BP's marketing consultants, the particular challenge of the youth climate movement was their authenticity. Quote, "Can we become more relatable, passionate, and authentic?" End quote. The task, according to BP's consultants, quote, "to engage and win back the trust of the people with the biggest voice," end quote. Again, those people they're referring to are the youth climate activists, and it's not because they've been so congenial. If you're more concerned about manners than survival, understand that that is a luxury. If you're fighting for a livable future, isn't that worth a little discomfort? After all, if you find civil disobedience unpleasant, you're going to hate climate change. Compromise and civility are the comforts of the rich and the powerful. If we want elites to act, we're going to have to make their complacency uncomfortable, and it's going to require some incivility. Again, this article was first published in The Nation. COP26 is over. There has been some movement forward, but for the most part, it's been more, as Greta would say, blah, blah, blah. We need to get beyond the talking. And I get it that talking about the problem, actually admitting that there is a problem, is movement forward. But we can't stay frozen in this "what do we do next" stance. We must move forward. And that's going to require, in my humble opinion, the voices of each and every one of us being heard. If you care about the future for your children and your grandchildren, most of us in my age bracket will get out relatively unscathed, at least most of us in the Western world, in the privileged Western world. But our kids and our grandkids won't. Both of my sons live in California. where the wildfires every year are getting worse and worse. When I visit them, there are days, there are weeks on end where we need to be masked, where the sun is red from the smoke. In fact, living here on the East Coast this summer, I was walking my dog down the block, and one of my neighbors was standing outside, and he was like, "Look at that sun. It's red. Isn't that beautiful?" George is an ex-pilot who's in his mid-70s, maybe late 70s. I had to remind him that the sun had changed color because of the wildfires in the West, and we're 2,500 miles away. This is real stuff. This is real. This is going to affect our kids and our grandkids. Please, please use your voice. Make your demands known to your legislators, to the companies that you support. Use your voice, use your dollars. Those are our superpowers. Thanks for listening. Thanks for caring. We'll catch you next time.
That's this week's episode of Best in Climate for Earth Feels.
Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for me.